We are started.
All right. Good, good exactly noontime, everybody. My name is Marissa Shu. I'm a commercial vegetable. Oh, I'm not a commercial. I'm an integrated pest management education educator for University of Minnesota Extension. I work with vegetable farmers on all things insects, diseases, and weeds. And this is kind of like my month of this webinar series. We'll be talking about pesty topics for the month of February. Today, we'll be talking about pumpkin integrated pest management, so different management actions we can take at different points in the year of growing pumpkins. Next week, we'll be talking about tomato problems, all the fun and interesting problems tomatoes get and how we can work around them. And then lastly, at the end of the month, we'll be talking about weeds. I'm sitting in a wheel hoe graveyard. They're not dead. They're very alive. They're very active teaching tools. So we'll be talking about weed management at the end of the month. But I'm excited to talk to you guys about pumpkins. So what we're going to talk about for the next 60-ish minutes is again, different pit stops and points in the year where we can make different pest management decisions about managing our pumpkin crop. As we go through, feel free to pop questions in the chat as we go. I see we have a question about slide sharing. I won't be sharing this slide deck, but at the end of this series, you will get a video recording of this webinar that's all captioned and everything. And a lot of the research I talk about, you can find the information on the University of Minnesota Extension website. And we'll talk about a few places where you can, a few different resources you can use as we go through this presentation. So let's get cracking. Okay, so where are we going to go? As I said, we're going to start by talking about what IPM is. It is a piece of jargon that is tied to my job title. So one I throw around a lot, but it informs our approach of how we think about managing insects, diseases, and weeds in all our crops. We're then going to go through by growth stage. So what pest management decisions do we have available to us as we pick a variety, as our seedlings get started, as our crops set fruit? Each one of those points, we have different pests and pest management actions we want to be prepared to take. So we'll check in at all those steps and talk about what we might do to manage our pests. So, what is IPM? IPM, or Integrated Pest Management, is a holistic approach to pest management. It's what a system of pest management where we understand our crops, we understand the pests they get, and we understand our farm. And those kinds of that, having that knowledge is going to be what allows us to make informed pest management decisions. What the decisions look like are going to be different for every farm. They might be primarily things like rotation, maybe organic controls, maybe conventional pesticides. Under all production theories, practices, IPM can be a really helpful framing tool for thinking about pests. Our first step in IPM is to build knowledge. So you guys are doing a great first step of IPM by being in this webinar today. So to manage pests well, we again have to understand pumpkins, their growth stages, the variety we chose, the pests we have in Minnesota, or maybe the pests that we've specifically dealt with on our farms before, and our production goals. Are we trying to get perfect bins of evenly sized pumpkins to sell to a grocery store? Or are we just trying to have a nice array for a farm side, roadside stand? Those production goals are going to inform what kind of decisions we make. For a bunch of different pests we'll talk about today, there's tipping points where it becomes worth it to do something about that pest. And some management, we have to time it really well in order for it to work. So that's where it's important to have that knowledge. It allows us to make good decisions at the right time. Then finally, under IPM, when we decide to manage a pest, we have a variety of control measures. Foundational are going to be our cultural controls, things like variety selection, crop rotation, stuff like that. We then have our physical controls like a deer fence to exclude the pest of deer. For some pests, we have biological controls, so living organisms that help us manage a living pests. And for some of our pests, the only thing we really have are our chemical controls. So those pesticides, be it organic, conventional, fungicide, insecticide. So when I think about how we select control measures in IPM, I oftentimes think of it as being a pyramid where culturals are our foundation and chemical controls are at the top. And I think of this as being kind of analogous to the food pyramid in the 80s and 90s. I know we have a food pyramid again, but this is the one I always think of. Did anybody grow up like with this one on the wall of like their elementary school classroom? Maybe. I guess you guys are all camera off, but this is what I saw when I was in school in the 90s. This food pyramid where we're being told, 6 to 11 servings of bread, cereal, rice, and pasta a day are the foundation of a healthy diet. Well, our that's not how we're supposed to eat. This is not how we think of a healthy diet anymore. I think of it as being an analog for how we do IPM, where our cultural controls, they're kind of like our old school nutrition carbs. We need a lot of these cultural controls in our diet in order to have pest control. Well, our chemical controls, they're like our fats, oils, and sweets, the things we use sparingly, only for special occasion, only for pests that have caused major losses for us in the past, or we know have the potential to cause major losses. So, with that framework in mind, let's start to talk about different pests we run into and pest management decisions and actions we should take at different points in the growing season. And we'll start out by the stuff we can do before planting. Yes, it is February. It's actually pretty warm outside for February, not like pumpkin warm, but it is warm. But that doesn't mean it is too early to start to think about how we're going to manage pests going forward. One of the biggest things we can do right now is pick varieties that are going to do well for us and help us avoid problems. Other pest management decisions we make this time of year is decisions around field selection and weed management. So, why is variety selection so important? It not just determines, what kind of size, what kind of color, what kind of shape, what level of quirkiness is the pumpkin variety you're going to be selling have, but it is also a really great way of dealing with issues you know you have on your farm. A lot of varieties, especially in pumpkins, have resistances to all kinds of, for example, plant diseases that we deal with every year in Minnesota. So if you know you've struggled with managing powdery mildew or viruses, or maybe some of the really tricky to manage soil-borne diseases like Fusarium or Phytophthora, picking a variety that has some genetic ability to deal with that disease on its own is going to be the foundation of good management. You don't need to go all in on a new variety, but trial one out. See, is this actually giving me less powdery mildew and the type of pumpkins my customers want? When you flip through seed catalogs, each seed company will have their own way of denoting, usually with three-letter acronyms, what kind of resistances or tolerances are built into that variety. If you want a one-stop shop to get an idea of how many varieties are out there that are um, marketed as having resistances from the company that's selling them, this QR code goes to a resource that's put together by Cornell University out in New York. They A lot of university research is built on an undergrad having a really weird and kind of boring job, but they have an undergrad who combs through as many seed catalogs as they can get their hands on every year and then list out varieties that are marketed as having different resistances. I'm going to quick show what this resource looks like. It's really helpful no matter what kind of vegetable you grow. This is a super helpful resource. So are we seeing a web page, Cornell web page here?
Yep.
Beautiful. Okay, so when you go to this, you'll be able to scroll down. Oops, I'm on the wrong one. So you'll get here, beautiful picture of peppers, and you'll get lists of different crops. So again, if you grow some of the other vegetables other than pumpkins, check this out for all your vegetables when you're trying to figure out what varieties you might want to try out this year. They have a whole section here for cucurbits. Gotta move my chat box here. When you go into that, this is a very long page because it includes cucumbers, watermelon, all the vine crops. So we'll control F for pumpkins. And here we go. We have a list of here are all these different, a lot of hybrid varieties that are advertised as having some genetic mechanism of getting less powdery mildew than other varieties. These aren't guarantees. They don't mean you will never see powdery mildew again, but powdery mildew is a fact of life when growing in Minnesota. So starting with variety that can do something against powdery mildew is really, really helpful. So I highly recommend checking out this website anytime you are growing vegetables and thinking about trialing a new variety. We back in the PowerPoint?
Yep.
I think
Looks good.
beautiful. Okay. Next thing we'll see as we're in those catalogs, deciding which pumpkin varieties we might want to buy, will be making a decision about do we want treated seeds or not. Sometimes companies, it is not, they'll say seeds are treated, and it's not always obvious what they are treated with. If we are growing organically, we want untreated seeds. If we're growing conventionally, treated seeds can potentially give us a really helpful tool in getting our plants started if we are trying to target certain beginning of the year problems. So don't just say treated seeds is enough. Check in on what actual treatment is on the seeds. Generally, there's two types of treatments you'll see in pumpkins. One will be a package, some kind of fungicide. There's a couple different names. Farmore is a very common one. Apron's another semi-common one. These are coated in systemic fungicides that will help you if you have a history of damping off seed rot, emergence type issues that you know are traced back to seeds sitting too long, getting wet, getting infected with something, getting mushy, not germinating. Occasionally, you will also see seeds that are treated with insecticides. So, Cruiser would be the trade name you'll often see when you're looking at neonicotinoid treated pumpkin seeds. The goal of seeds treated with this are to give you a few weeks early in the season of protection from insects, in particular striped cucumber beetle. It's unclear if striped cucumber beetle is able to overwinter in Minnesota, but if this is a bug that you feel you see as soon as your pumpkins come out and you know their heavy level of feeding has killed your seeds before, this can give you a few weeks of protection early in the season. This might not be right for every farmer. So, for example, if you are someone who transplants pumpkins, for example, your seeds are going to be in the greenhouse both for most of that window where you're getting insecticide protection from that neonicotinoid. So you can save some money. You don't need that kind of treated seed. So if you're buying a treated seed, check what's actually going on there. Again, I was just poking around a bunch of company websites this morning. They can really bury what that actual treatment is. So check in on it and see if it's actually something that will help you with your problems. Another big decision we'll make this time of year, maybe as we're sitting down with our farm maps, is picking a planting spot. It's really important for pumpkins that they're not planted in the same place year after year after year. We have a lot of really gnarly, long-lived soil-borne diseases in pumpkins. And so growing our pumpkins in a different spot on our farm every year is a great tool for preventing those diseases from popping up their ugly, fruit rotty little heads. This can be really hard to do. So, for example, maybe some of us are agritourism farmers where we have to think about our where our cider and donut stand is, where the parking lot is. But I highly encourage everyone figure out a way to just get your pumpkins in a different spot than they were last year. Ideally, we want them to not be planted in the same spot for 3 to 5 years after pumpkins have been there last. Another really helpful thing rotation can provide us is other tools to go after tricky weeds. Pumpkins, weed control is a challenge. It's a challenge in all vegetables, but we have different cultivation tools, maybe different herbicides that are available when we grow a crop that isn't pumpkins. So planting something like corn or soybeans, where we have a lot more effective herbicide options that are sometimes a lot cheaper than the stuff we have in vegetables, can be a great way of dealing with really tricky weeds that can build up if we're growing vegetable on vegetable or pumpkin on pumpkin on pumpkin. The other thing we want to think about and make sure we have in line and are ready to act on is any type of pre-emergent herbicide we want to use. Pre-emergent herbicides, we don't have a ton we can use in pumpkins, but the ones we do have are super effective and really, really helpful in starting the season clean and dealing with weeds, especially when the plants are small and less able to compete with weeds. Here we have some pictures from just basic, herbicide trials done at Michigan State. We have our untreated control over here, and here we have a plot that has been treated with a pre-emergence, in this case, the herbicide called Strategy. So there are 5 to 10 different herbicides that are available to be used pre-emergent on pumpkin. And the reason I'm telling you to think about it before you plant is because the window when you can use these herbicides is very, very small. A lot of them, the window is between the time you plant the seed and the time the seedling emerges, between the time you plant the seed and when the soil cracks. It is a very narrow window. So you have to be ready to go shortly after planting if you're going to use a pre-emergent. So thinking about that, checking on the products, making sure you understand how to use them, that is a task that is maybe best done this time of year when you have time to be at your computer, be at your tablet to look at labels. There's a lot of nuances in how these products work and how you have to apply them. So do some research. This QR code here will go to a blog post on the University of Minnesota Extension Fruit and Vegetable blog. Um, you might get the newsletter weekly, but this in particular goes to a specific article that talks all about weed control in pumpkin and has a flow chart that can help you figure out, okay, I mostly have broadleaf weeds, but I also have some nut sedge. Which herbicide is going to give me the best control of my specific weeds? So if you've never used a pre-emergent before and maybe you're curious about it or you want to see, is there something more effective for the weeds I have? Check out the attached article at this QR code as well as the flow chart. Another thing we can do around the time of planting, but again, we have to plan for it, is make big reductions in the amount of weed seeds in our field. In the last, what, decade, we've talked a lot about soil health. So maybe we're used to thinking about our soil, as full of living organisms, as having, organic matter and sand and little rocks, but we also have weed seeds in our soil. Every farm has weed seeds in their soil that make up their weed seed bank. That is where most of our weed problems come from. And it's very rare as vegetable farmers to get windows where we can just really aggressively go after weeds and get some of those seeds out of our seed bank so we don't have to deal with them anymore. And pumpkins provide a really nice opportunity to do a technique that weed scientists call the stale seedbed technique. This is something we can do in crops that are planted kind of late. So stuff like maybe pumpkins or sweet corn, where the soil needs to get pretty warm for these crops to germinate. So maybe we have a field that we're not planting into until late May, early June, maybe even mid-June, in some parts of Minnesota. And that window of time, we can trick our weed seeds into germinating at a time when we can just go in and kill them. So in the stale seed bag technique, we know we have seeds in our seeds in our soil. We'll go through and prep our field like we're going to plant, but we'll do this way before we actually intend on planting our pumpkins. This tells the weed seeds it is time to germinate. All of a sudden, the soil's turned, it's getting warm, they're starting to maybe get some spring rains. This is going to trigger our weed seeds to grow, but we don't have a crop there yet. So those weed seeds start growing and we can mow them down anyway with a lot of different tools. We use chemical controls, we can use, broad spectrum herbicides like glyphosate. If we are more of an organic farm, we can go in and kill these weeds with really light tillage if we get them at the right time. So this allows us again to kill tons of weeds, flush a bunch of weed seeds out of the top few inches of our soil, and then we can plant our pumpkins into something that is a little bit more weed free. This is a really underutilized weed control technique and one that I think that is well suited to pumpkin production. So now we're going to shift ahead in time. So we've picked our varieties, we've planted them, maybe we've used a pre-emergent, maybe we've stale seed bedded, and now our pumpkin plants are emerging. Once our pumpkins start to enter the seedling stage, our pest management gets a little bit more active and a little bit more hands-on. The foundation of all in-season pest management is going to be scouting. So we want to make sure we start a weekly scouting plan in our pumpkins to make sure we are catching potential issues at a time when they correct them. Things we'll especially want to have our eye on as we're scouting our young seedling stage pumpkins is going to be one, check in on any our stand establishment issues that might be present. Check in on our weed control, figure out did that work or not? Do I like the weed control strategy I picked? I'd also check in on cucumber beetle. So, what does it mean to scout? Scouting is again a eye to the ground, close to plant, weekly check-in on what's going on in our fields. So ideally, we're walking through our fields in a semi-random pattern. Maybe it looks like an M from above. Maybe it looks like an X from above. We have tools that make it easier for us to do diagnosis. So a hand lens, so we can see, okay, this leaf has a spot on it. Is that spot fuzzy? Does it look like a fungus or does it look like an insect? If we find an insect and the insect's really small, hand lens can also help with that, as well as tools to take issues that are we've never seen before and get them out of the fields, maybe into the cab where we can run the AC and actually have a coherent thought. So things like knives, baggies, some type of record keeping system, be it paper or tech. All good ideas when you're scouting, but the most important part about scouting is honestly just to do it. It's a little bit of a habit to build, but if you have had pests get away from you in the past and had major crop losses, this is our main tool for preventing those crop losses. So, things we might see as we're scouting, as our stands get established. We might see, hey, we have blank spots in our field. There should be a row of pumpkins here planted, every few feet. No pumpkins here. What happened? If we're seeing this, maybe we have a little shovel with us, maybe like a hoary knife. We want to dig. Dig in that spot where we think that seed is at. If we find a seed, take a look at it. Why didn't it germinate? Is it mushy and rotten? So maybe we have some kind of root rot problem. Are there maggots in it? Parts of Minnesota have very high populations of seed corn maggots. So it's an adult fly whose larvae feed on and kill large seeded crops like pumpkins and beans. Maybe you'll see wireworms. So these guys are kind of maybe an inch long, leathery, crunchy, wiggly little immature beetles. You oftentimes see these guys most often if your field was previously fallow, maybe in pasture, maybe in CRP. Not super common, but we do see it. If we're not seeing any of this, maybe we're not seeing a seed at all. I tend to think planter issues. Is our planter actually dropping seeds every time we think it is? or occasionally vertebrates, so things like birds, taking those seeds away and eating them. The other really big pest we want to check in on this time of year is going to be our striped cucumber beetle. When plants are really small, they can be super vulnerable to the level of high amount of feeding striped cucumber beetles can do when their population is high. If when we're scouting, we're seeing an average of more than one striped cucumber beetle per plant, we might want to consider treatment. And whenever we talk about the treatments and pesticides in this webinar, we'll be talking about one resource, the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide. Maybe you've used this in the past. It has been available for a long time as a pretty thick book where if you open it, the first half is like how to grow different vegetables. And then the back half is like, here are all the products you can use to manage pest X on Y crop. And this is a great resource that is updated annually. And it is an effort across 8 Midwest states. So you get, like the big gun researchers from Ohio, from Indiana, from Michigan, feeding the results of their spray trials into this guide. And so anytime you're considering using a pesticide, check this guide to see what works well in our region. So let's take a quick look at what this guide looks like. So I'm going to quick switch my screen share over to the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide. This QR code will also take you there. This website looks pretty good on mobile. So when you're on the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide, you will end up at a homepage that looks like this. If you're old school and you want to use a big PDF copy of the guide, if you click hard copy guide up here, you'll get an option to download the whole PDF, which is like 250 pages if you really want to work your printer. You can also just download the pumpkins chapter if you just want to know printed pest management about pumpkins. If you're not someone who likes printing, I don't use the printed version anymore. I mostly use this. So we use this, we can use it in lots of different ways. We could say, I'm growing pumpkins. Let's do that. So we'll start with our crop. We'll say, I'm growing pumpkins. And then we'll choose our pest. So here, let's say we're managing cucumber beetle. We enter cucumber beetle and it will chug for a little bit. Depends on how many products are available, how long it has to think. But what it's doing is popping out this nice output. So I get an output that looks like this. And you could do this for pumpkins and powdery mildew, or pumpkins and phytophthora, or pumpkins and grass type weeds. Lots of different ways you can use this guide. You'll get an output that looks like this. The first box will give you pest information. It will tell you a little bit about the biology of the pest. If there's a threshold we use in the region, that will be listed. It will tell you non-pesticide options. So if you are an organic grower or someone who really wants to hone in on the cultural or the physical controls, open up this box. And then below that, you'll get a list of all the pesticides that are labeled and perform well on the specific pest of interest in our region. So we have lots of different potential options if we are trying to deal with cucumber beetle and pumpkins. If we're an organic grower, we can click Armory listed and it will just pop in just the things that have that organic approved OMRI listing. So this is a super flexible and helpful resource. Looks really good on mobile. You don't need to log in. So something I highly request, or not request, I think is a great idea to bookmark something like this and know it's available when you're trying to manage pests in the season. All right, so let's shift ahead a few more weeks. So we're not quite in that seedling stage yet, but we're at vine out. So our rows are going to close soon. Our pumpkins are going to go into that stage where they just grow really big, really fast, and all of a sudden our field is going to become pretty impassable. When I scout pumpkins, this is always like, okay, this is the last stage where I can scout these pumpkins without being scared that I'm gonna accidentally step on some small immature pumpkin somewhere in this field, roll my ankle, fall down, and never get found. We're still in that like manageable, we can see the difference between plants stage of pumpkin growth. We're still going to want to be scouting, but things will change. We are going to, our plants are going to get a little bit bigger, so you don't have to worry about cucumber beetle as much, but we do want to check in on weed control. So after our pumpkins get out of that small, vulnerable, seedling, only a few leaf stage, once they have 4 or more leaves, the threshold boosts up. It takes more cucumber beetles to really knock our plants back. So instead of using the 1 beetle threshold we were using when plants were really small, now we're going to use a threshold of 5 beetles per plant as the trigger to potentially manage cucumber beetles in our planting. We also, in this period, enter a time where we have options to do weed control that's not just pre-emergence. There are a few post-emergent herbicides that we can use in pumpkins. Which ones are available to us depend on what kind of sprayer we have. We have a couple options that require a banded sprayer because the product cannot touch the crop. And we also have some chemistries that can potentially cause crop damage. But we have a window here. The window is oftentimes before flowering, before female flowers appear is generally this hard stop point for like no more post-emergence available of any kind. We also have a potential here, if we're not going to use chemical controls, to do some physical weed control. This is the time of year we can still get out there and sneak in, some light tillage, light cultivation to disturb some of those weeds that might have started to grow and emerging. Um, because again, if we wait till after vine out, the tractor's not getting through, we are going to hurt our pumpkin plants. This time of pumpkin growth also tends to be when we see herbicide injury. So our pre-emergents, a lot of them need to sit in a certain place in the profile of the soil. And if we have really wet springs after we've applied the pre-emergent, it can wash too deeply or can collect in low spots, and that can cause herbicide injury. And this is becoming more and more common as our springs weather gets a little bit more unpredictable every year. We've had a lot of really, really heavy rain events, which does not play well with a lot of our pre-emergent herbicide. So if we're seeing plant yellowing, the shrinking of leaves, those are the first type of clues that maybe we have some accidental pre-emergent herbicide injury going on. Other clues to look at would be like one, is this in a low spot? Is this in a place where water and then that pre-emergent is going to collect and be at higher rates? The thing to look at will be the how uniform is the age of the leaves that are being affected. So, for example, when I've seen injury in vine crops, it is, the third and fourth leaves of all the pumpkins in an area all have this extreme bleached leaf with yellow veins still green appearance. And it's only those third and fourth leaves when the fifth leaf comes out, they look a little stressed, but they they don't look like this. If you suspect you have something like this, reach out to me. I'm always happy to take a look because this is something it's very hard to develop an eye on because it doesn't happen to everybody every year. Shifting forward a little bit, so we are entering the period where the vines are out, our rows are closed, getting through the fields a lot harder, and we're starting to see first our male flowers, then our female flowers. So we're entering that kind of July to July, mid-June, July period. So again, new stage of crop growth, new pest considerations. One big thing that is going to kind of hang over all of our pest control decisions from here on out is going to be pollinators. Whether you are renting or managing your own honey beehives, then we want to make sure we protect pollinators. But Minnesota is also home to native species of bees that evolved specifically to pollinate pumpkins and other vine crops. So Minnesota is home to a bee easily enough called the squash bee. They look a lot like bumblebees. They're very similar size. They're yellow, they're fuzzy, they have stripes. They have longer antennae than honeybees do. That's one of the easier ways to tell them apart. And these guys, again, they evolved to pollinate stuff like pumpkins. They are a very effective pollinator. And they're native. They want to be where the pumpkins are, but they're very different than honeybees. We don't manage them. These guys live alone in a tunnel in the ground. So they need a little bit of help from us, and they need us to be thoughtful in order for them to be able to survive and give us free, effective pollination of our pumpkins. So, general guiding practices whenever we're starting to think about managing pests, especially as flowers are present, is to consider pollinator protection. For pumpkins, this oftentimes means limiting applications, so using thresholds, as well as applying later in the day. The later it is in the day, the more our pumpkin flowers close up, so bees are not going to be visiting them, not as active in our field. And generally, most species have a peak of activity kind of in the morning through early afternoon, and then they take a siesta and retire early. So when we apply at dusk in the evening, much less likely that bees are going to be active in the places where we're making applications. So, who might we be making applications to manage? At this point, not as much for cucumber beetle. Cucumber beetles are super, super attracted to the smell and the chemicals that are inside the flowers of pumpkins. So once flowers come out, cucumber beetles like to hang out in them. And when we've looked at research on does this guy feeding in flowers hurt yield? It doesn't. So we don't need to worry about these guys as much once they start hanging out inside of flowers. But unfortunately, as these guys go away, they step away, we have other pests that become a problem. This is when we start to see squash vine borer, for example. This is a pest we start to see sometime in July. As an adult, it looks a lot like a moth. They are big, loud, day flying. They're orange with clear wings. They're wasp mimic. They lay their eggs on the stems of all our vine crops. They especially like things like pumpkins and zucchini. Out of these eggs hatches a caterpillar, which then, in short order, burrows into the crown of our plant, eats all that connective tissue in the crown, and eventually our crops will start to wilt. They'll wilt in the heat of the day, but the next morning they won't have recovered. It's very common for vine crops with the really big leaves to wilt in the heat of the noontime sun. But if we're seeing pumpkins that have not recovered by morning, that after a cool night, those leaves are still wilted, check in on those crowns. Squash vine borer is a very, very common culprit. These guys are very, very tricky to manage because when we're thinking about when can we treat squash vine borer, we can't treat the adults. They move around really quick. They visit flowers, they lay eggs. We can't treat the eggs. We don't have pesticides that kill eggs. If we have a small planting, maybe we can find these eggs and scrape them off, but even then, these eggs are really small. Once the caterpillar are inside that crown, we can't reach them anymore. So really, our treatment range is between the time when eggs hatch and caterpillar goes into crown. So maybe in the span of a few hours, we need that caterpillar to get targeted by an insecticide, which again, really a small window, especially for a pest that is flying and laying eggs for like a month and a half. So for this one, timing that treatment is super, super hard. And I have to time just think maybe instead of trying to manage this guy intensively, let's overplant and assume we're probably going to lose some of our pumpkins to squash vine borer. Sometime in July is also when we start to see our other big pumpkin pest in Minnesota, squash bug. So these guys look a little bit like stink bugs, but instead of being, shield shaped like the stink bug that is maybe like crawling around the ceiling of your room right now, these guys are a little bit more elongated and they're attracted to vine crops. So you'll find them in vine crops. So adults will emerge. They will lay clusters of copper colored eggs on the underside of leaves, but also just anywhere like major veins meet on a pumpkin leaf. Out of these will hatch the larvae, which are gray, blobby. They're of a distinct shape. I don't want to say they're blobby, that's rude, but they're not super distinct in shape. They're like a little gray oval with legs, which feed and grow and feed and grow. They have a piercing, sucking mouth part that they use to suck juices out of our pumpkin leaves. So if we get really high numbers of these guys feeding on our pumpkin leaves, they will get shriveled and crispy, and so our pumpkin plant will die back earlier than we want it to. We're also learning that these guys are vectoring a new virus that we haven't seen in Minnesota, but we are starting to see in other parts of the Midwest. So, squash bug is a little bit easier to track and to treat than our squash vine borer. So, for these guys, we can scout for them. It's very easy to see all of their life stages. These guys are not they're not that secretive about hiding their eggs, and the eggs are pretty obvious. We can scrape eggs off when we see them, but if we're seeing a lot of eggs, so like an average of one egg mass per plant, that might prompt us to want to make an application of an insecticide to do something about them. But again, we can't kill insect eggs with insecticides. So if we see a lot of eggs, we want to give it 7 to 10 days for those eggs to hatch. And then we're hopefully treating when the eggs have hatched and it's just small, immature squash bugs out there. These guys, when they're small, immature, still gray, they're way easier to kill with insecticides than the big adults who are mobile and much harder to kill. Now we're going to move ahead more towards that August, September. So we have fruit in the field. They're starting to size up. They're starting to ripen. The color is starting to change. What pests are we dealing with now? So once we have fruit set, big things to worry about are going to be powdery mildew, as well as weeds, and then finally checking out your cull pile as a place that might let us know what our emerging pest issues are. So we talked about powdery mildew at the start as something to check if your varieties you're growing have resistance to. Powdery mildew is something that doesn't survive year round in Minnesota. It's something that blows up from southern states every year. And we tend to see it in Minnesota sometime in mid to late July. Pumpkins that have set fruit. I don't know, maybe some of you guys have kids. Having kids is really stressful. Stressful for us, stressful on our pumpkins too. Once they start setting fruit, they seem to become much more susceptible to powdery mildew. Another unique thing about powdery mildew, as far as diseases goes, is that if you've ever read anything about vegetable disease, a lot of them like humid weather, they like lots of rain, they like splashing water. Powdery mildew is the rare plant disease that like it likes wet weather, but it also can get started and move around in dry weather. So even in summers in Minnesota where it's really hot, dry, droughty, we will still see powdery mildew. And this is something we do want to scout for, especially if we've had losses and we're considering using fungicides on it. So to scout for powdery mildew, again, we want to go through our field randomly and we want to really get into the canopy of our plants. Powdery mildew starts in the densest part of the canopy on the underside of the oldest leaf. So you really got to like get in there to check underside of leaf because it's really important to catch powdery mildew when it's at that stage. Whenever we're talking about spraying to prevent plant diseases, we're doing prevention, not cure. So the threshold for treatment, instead of being like one egg mass per plants, it is usually at trace, is what plant pathologists will say. So as soon as you see signs of the disease, that would be when you start using your fungicides because they're going to slow down the rate of that infection. They're not going to cure the plant. They're not going to make sure you never see that disease again. They're going to slow down that disease so you can hopefully keep the life in your plants. Hold on to your leaves, hold on to your photosynthesis so that you're still going to get the maximum pumpkin crop you can. Another thing to note about powdery mildew is that it is a very fast evolving disease. So if you're someone who has used fungicides for this in the past, the fungicides that worked 10 years ago when I started working in extension, they are totally different than the fungicides we use now. So this is one where you want to check every year to see if the products you're interested in using are still effective and working in the Midwest. So here's what powdery mildew looks like. I'm sure you've seen it if you've grown vine crops before. I'm sure you've seen it at this stage. You know, you got the white out where it gets its name, the powdered stage to like the crispity dead leaf stage. We want to catch it if we're going to treat it in like it looks like a faint yellow spot on the surface of the leaf and on the underside. If we get in there, that's where we see the spores. That is going to be the level of infection we're talking about if we want to have an effective fungicide program. So, as I said earlier, fungicides change often. So, check out the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide to see what's still working. Make sure you scout for it. And when you stop your program, about 3 weeks out from when you harvest, at that point, the crop has gotten most of the energy it needs. You're not going to, any boost you'd get from your crop, the cost of your fungicides is not going to pay for that. So, about a month out from when you're going to harvest, you can stop making your powdery mildew applications. Another important thing to do as harvest approaches is deadhead weed escapes. Um, this might seem, maybe it seems neurotic. I don't know. I've had farmers be like, I feel like being, you're attacking my level of weed control whenever we're walking the field and you're removing weeds. But I remove weed escapes because I care. When we think about the common weeds we have in all of our vegetable crops, one of the reasons they're a weed is because they make tons and tons of seeds, and those seeds live a really long time in our soil. So if we're thinking about, this weed seed bank that maybe we tried to reduce with our stale seed bed technique, just one of these weeds escaping and setting seeds is adding thousands of seeds that we will deal with in our soil and in our fields for a long time. I've heard weed scientists say that 1 year's seeding is 7 years weeding. So, as you're scouting, as you're walking your field, yank, yank out that ragweed that got away from you or that lamb's quarters. It doesn't have to get rid of it. We don't want those seeds in our field giving us a headache for the next decade. Finally, one last place to look at is not just, we're harvesting pumpkins. They look great. Our customers are happy. But it's also sometimes helpful to check in on the pumpkins that aren't making it, the ones we're leaving in the field, especially if we feel like we're leaving a lot of stuff in the field. We can learn a lot about what management practices we might want to change next year by looking at the stuff that wasn't good enough to harvest. So if you're looking at your field, at the end of the year, sales are winding down, vines are dead, things to that should send up a little red flag and concern you and make you want to do more research and check next year. One would be if you have pumpkin plants that where they're touching, or pumpkin fruit where they're touching the soil line, it's like they have these white powdery sugar spores that are coming up from the soil line and climbing on the plant. Or maybe you've seen it where you harvested a bin of pumpkins a week ago. They looked fine. They looked beautiful. You go to take them out of storage and they're melting down. Again, you're seeing this white fuzz. The pumpkins are, oh, they'll smell so bad. They'll be liquidy, goopy, not good for sale anymore. When we see stuff like this, these are indications that we might have Phytophthora in our fields. Phytophthora is a disease I hope none of this looks familiar to you. I never want growers to have to experience Phytophthora. It's a really devastating, long-lived soil-borne disease that not only affects pumpkins, but affects things like peppers and beans as well. So if you see stuff like this, maybe if you're, check through your camera roll. If you see anything that looks like that, flag that as something you want to look at and check for more this year. If you're seeing pumpkins that got left in the field because they're covered in a sticky black goo, this likely means that at some point in the season you had an aphid problem. So the sticky black goo, what we call it is sooty mold, but what it actually is, it means that on the leaves above that pumpkin, there were aphids. Aphids are tiny insects that suck out plant juices, but they can't digest everything they suck up. So they leak out this sugary sap that will fall on whatever's below it. If the thing below it is one of your pumpkins, that goo is going to stick and it's going to get moldy, hence the sooty mold. So we're seeing this. We have probably had aphid problems, but dealing with aphid problems can be kind of counterintuitive. Aphids tend to be what we call a like pest that flares up, more of a secondary pest. So aphids are most common in years where we have hot, dry weather, but also in fields where people really aggressively manage cucumber beetle or squash vine borer or squash bug. Maybe people aren't using thresholds and are just applying weekly, regardless of what is actually happening in their fields. What happens in these cases is that they kill the target pest with their insecticide applications. They kill some aphids, but not all of them. Aphids reproduce super, super fast. One female aphid can give live birth to clones. So our aphids bounce back way faster than our other pests do, but they also bounce back way faster than our beneficial insects. So they're like the Skittles of the insect world. If you're a bug that eats other bugs, you love to eat aphids, whether you're a ladybug, a lacewing, a parasitoid wasp. There are tons of native insects in Minnesota that like to eat aphids, and they also get killed by insecticide applications. So if we're seeing a lot of sooty mold, check in with your insecticide program. Check, verify how often am I actually applying? Are the things I'm applying broad spectrum? Are they going to kill the pests and the natural enemies? Maybe I need to scout to actually verify populations are worth spraying so I'm not overusing insecticides and allowing these aphid problems to flare up. If you're seeing a lot of pumpkins that have soft depressions, kind of with amorphous edges, this oftentimes is caused by sunburn. Here, if we're seeing a lot of this, the thing to think is, how is my leaf coverage? Are my plants getting enough nutrition so that the leaf coverage is good and healthy? And generally, Minnesota pumpkins are. So the next thing to think then is, am I holding on to my leaves for long enough? Am I fending off the insect pests? Am I fending off powdery mildew long enough so that my ripening pumpkins are not getting exposed to really extreme, bright, hot sunlight, which is going to kill the surface tissue? Just like we get sunburns, our pumpkins can also get sunburn. We avoid it by using sunscreen. Pumpkins avoid it by having a healthy leaf canopy. Maybe one of the more common post-harvesty type problems I see in pumpkins is the handle of the pumpkins, like the stem that is attached to the fruit. It gets really crunchy, it gets withered, and it falls off. I feel like people at the pumpkin patch always want to grab the pumpkin by the handle. Like, not great. Not every pumpkin variety is going to be able to handle that. But if our pumpkin stem is infected with powdery mildew, it is definitely not going to be able to handle that. So if you're getting a lot of pumpkins where that handle's falling off, again, the answer is check in on your powdery mildew program. Thing that we're seeing increasingly in our region is pumpkins that develop kind of discrete. I think these look like zits. Like, I don't know, maybe you remember being a teenager, maybe you have a teenager. If you're seeing things on your pumpkin plant or your pumpkin fruit that look like a whitehead, it could be a newer disease we're seeing called bacterial leaf spot. So just like how we talked about city mold is like there's aphids on the leaves and the aphids are dripping, bacterial leaf spot is an infection that happens on the leaves. If those leaves are above our pumpkin fruit and those leaves get wet, there's bacterial leaf spot on the leaves. Bacteria will hitch a ride from that leaf spot onto our pumpkin and cause a spot on our pumpkins. If you're seeing this, I'd be really curious to see it. I don't have a good understanding of how widespread it is in Minnesota, but it's becoming more widespread in other states in the Midwest. And if you're dealing with a lot of it, um, get it verified and then add some antibacteria, bactericide type products to your spray regime. So maybe some copper or some manzate. Copper if you're an organic grower or a conventional grower, manzate if you're conventional. Okay, so that was a lot. Growing pumpkins, it can be really easy, but it can also get really hard if we have lots of pest challenges. So how do we put this all together? One, make sure you're scouting weekly. It's hard to make time for, but again, if you're not catching insects early, if you're not catching diseases early, you don't really have a good shot at slowing them down about protecting your yields. Two, find places you can get timely info that will help guide your scouting and management. Every week in the summer, Natalie Hoydel, who you've heard from if you've been on this webinar, and I, as well as Madeline Wimmer, we all write weekly newsletters that are basically a summary of like, hey, growers call us every day. Here are the things we've talked to growers about. We go out and visit farms and scout. Here's the things we're seeing in scouting. So it's kind of like a heads up, this is what we saw in southeastern Minnesota this week. Growers in other parts of the state should be on the lookout. Powdery mildew's here. Cucumber beetles having a boom year. That kind of stuff. You can find that in our newsletter. You can subscribe to it. We don't spam you. It comes once a week, usually on Thursdays. And finally, have plans in place for common problems. So be like, okay, I have a plan for how I'm going to manage weeds. There's always going to be weeds in pumpkins, so have a plan. Powdery mildew, always going to happen. Have a plan in place for how you want to deal with powdery mildew. Having that kind of knowledge built before the season can help you make informed decisions on the fly in the heat of the growing season when you have so much on your plate and limited hours of daylight. All right. So that's all I have. I hope you guys got a nice little IPM refresher and then some helpful info about all the different kinds of pest issues we can run into when we grow pumpkins in Minnesota. There's my email if you think of any questions after we're done. And again, this recording will find its way to your inbox in like two-ish months. And we have plenty of time for questions. I'd also love it if you guys filled out this poll. This webinar is a newer offering from our team this year. So you telling us this rocked, this sucked, I wish you talked about X, Y, and Z. That type of stuff is really helpful for us to make sure we are offering programming that is relevant and helpful to all of you guys. We work to serve farmers across the state, and your feedback helps us make sure we're meeting that goal for you. So yeah, I'm happy to take any questions either in the chat or if anyone wants to, dare I say, come off mic. That's always a little scary.
There was one in the Q&A as well.
Oh,
What
beautiful.
would be the ground temp when weed seeds start to germinate?
Mm, that varies for each species of weed seeds, and that can be something where it can be really helpful to like get to know your weeds really well. We'll talk about that in the webinar in 2 weeks, but I'll put in the chat a resource that I love that talks about it has really in-depth profiles on all the different weeds we see in the Midwest, and it tells you what germination temperatures they need because it does vary by each species of weed. Some they germinate when it's cold, and then they have like a cutoff. Some are like, I love it when it's really hot. I can germinate at all kinds of temperatures. So it really depends on the specific weeds you're battling on your farm.
Next one in the chat here. Does diatomaceous earth powder?
Diatomaceous earth. Yeah.
Oh, yep, there you go.
Oh, I got you. Okay, one second. Let me just find this chat box, drop this link. So I'm posting a link to
Okay.
A Sarah book that you can buy, but also it's all online and it's really nice. I I write part of the Midwest Vegetable Production Guide, so I feel like I should say that's my favorite extension resource, but I think I love this Sarah book that I just posted that's about weed management. I think I love that one more. So I have a question in the Q&A about diatomaceous earth and if that helps manage squash borers or squash bugs. So diatomaceous earth is a rock that has a lot of really interesting uses. Like you can get it as like a food grade thing that they put in like grains to keep grain beetles from being able to eat it. It's made of like crushed up seashells of like ancient sea dwelling organisms. And the way it hurts pests is like the insect scrapes its body up against it. That creates all these micro tears that then like cause the insect to dry out. So there's some places where we know it works really well. So like in stored grains, we know the pests there are like little immature beetles that are crawling in the grains. They're going to hit the diatomaceous earth, get scraped up and die. When we're talking about insects outdoors, it gets much less effective, partially because those insects, a lot of the ways they move is not like wiggling directly against stuff. You know, our cucumber beetles have legs, they're elevated. They're not going to hit a diatomaceous earth layer that is just applied to the surface of the soil. And the other thing is that these products are made of like crushed up seashells. So I think of it being kind of like if you're from the southeastern Minnesota, like all the limestone, the sandstone, like those really soft, can't believe we talk about geology. These really soft rocks that like wear away with water really easy. Diatomaceous earth is kind of the same way, where when it gets wet, all those sharp edges that make it work, they get dull because it's a really soft material that doesn't tolerate getting wet. So I don't think of diatomaceous earth as being something that works really well or does anything for us with a lot of our outdoor pests, unfortunately. Oh, we have a question about planting indeterminated cover crops as a green mulch for weed prevention. Um, does that prevent pests? Yes, it can, but it's a really tricky system to get to work. So, an example system that is very common in some parts of our region is growers plant a winter rye crop in the fall. It comes back in the spring. The grower kills it somehow. You can either use roller crimping if you hit that rye at a very certain point in its life cycle, or you can terminate it with like a broad spectrum herbicide like glyphosate. You then plant your pumpkins into it, and you have like this, they're basically growing on like this thick layer of straw that you grew yourself. Um, this can help with weeds, but it's not complete weed control. You oftentimes still need pre-emergent herbicides to manage weeds in these systems. There can also be all these like unforeseen, tricky parts of getting these systems to work. So a colleague of mine at Purdue University, Liz Maynard, she's been running like horticulture vegetable trials for like 20 years. She had a couple of years where she was trying out the system, and each year they like discovered a new hiccup that they didn't anticipate. So one year they're like, we got the rye terminated, but then there was way more mouse activity. So like a bunch of our seeds got eaten. So next year we're going to try to figure out a way to not have our seeds get eaten. So it can be a really helpful system in some ways, but I think it's also easy to say like it will solve all your problems. And like it won't solve all your problems. It'll make some of them less bad. And you'll also have problems you could not have anticipated. So if it's something you're interested in, trial it in a small area, but don't go in, do not go in whole hog all at once because all kinds of really interesting things can happen in that system. I have a private chat question that is about voles, moles, and ground squirrels. I know I need to add vertebrate pests to this presentation, but the answers are so unsatisfying when you're talking about not like the pest it's ever that satisfying, but when we're talking about like stuff that digs in the ground, a lot of it is like trapping, flooding. If you have farmer friends, your farmer friends have the best creative solutions for dealing with moles, voles, and ground squirrels that I should not say on a university webinar that's going to be recorded. But there's lots of ways to deal with them that involve traps, water, flooding holes, plugging holes, all kinds of stuff like that. So I'm a little scared to open up the chat box to everybody's ways of dealing with these burrowing pests. Um, that'd be a good icebreaker. So maybe a little bit of a macabre extension event if we opened with that. All right. Any other questions for the good of the order before I we close this one up and send you on your merry way? All right. Well, thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you, some of you guys next week when we talk about the diva behavior of tomatoes. All right. Have a good rest of the afternoon, everybody.